From our studios in New York, here is Jane Pauley.
Lucile Ball, First Lady of American television. She died 7 years ago, but in a way has never left us because almost all of her television shows are still in syndication. And I Love Lucy remains the most watched and most loved TV sitcom of all time. Even so, when a manuscript of an unpublished autobiography turned up in a lawyer's file cabinet, even her own children were surprised. Tonight, a never-before-seen portrait of Lucy, and the reason TV's most successful partnership was an odds-on failure at home.
How's this oven door get open?
They said, you're the right height and you're a nice girl, but you just don't seem to have it.
Lucile Ball didn't have it? You gotta be kidding. By the mid-50s, she'd already staked a claim as the First Lady of television.
I refuse to discuss anything with a sneak.
A snick?
All right, a snick.
Lucy and Desi were just about the most famous couple in America. Maybe Lucy and Ricky still are.
Because I had to toll her.
They were the first TV family we felt like we really knew. Even their personal home movies, like these from 1953, have a feel of familiarity. It's easy to forget that there was a private Lucy, different from the one who came into America's living rooms every week.
Lucy?
Oh, gee, I'm glad you're home. How's about a great big... I'll see you later.
For one thing, in real life, she didn't sound at all like any of the Lucys from her TV shows.
What's the matter?
I didn't know that there was this kind of success. I didn't dream of it for myself.
That's the real Lucy talking. On tape recordings that were discovered last fall in a lawyer's file cabinet, along with a manuscript. Not even her family knew what they were. Her daughter, actress Lucy Arnaz.
Total shock. Yeah, total shock. I mean, she had never mentioned to me ever that she had even intended on sitting down and writing about her life.
In 1964, Lucy was telling her story to Betty Hannah Hoffman, a writer for Ladies' Home Journal.
I was expecting the dizzy redhead, you know, from television. And it was quite a shock because she had a deep, gravelly voice. She didn't have that high, pitchy voice she has on television. She's very serious. She wasn't funny.
But without explanation, after several months of work, Lucy changed her mind. A first draft of a manuscript was put away, and everybody, possibly Lucy included, just forgot about it. But now, 30 years later, her children, Lucy and Desi Jr., a musician, decided to publish it. It's called Love, Lucy.
After all of this time, when everybody thought she's gone, and she's said as much as she's going to say about her life, that there was suddenly this magical thing that just showed up one day that she could go and tell the story of her own life herself.
The audio tapes must be haunting.
Having her voice on tape, telling these exact stories in the book is just the most priceless thing.
A lot of what she talks about in the book, though, are things that happened that we didn't talk that much about. Her early childhood and her teenage years and when she first left home, and things that she didn't really go into detail with us about. Because, you know, when you're with your parents, you're talking about what's happening now. They're not reminiscing all the time.
My mother worked very hard. My mother worked very hard and under very difficult circumstances.
Lucy's mother, Desiree Ball, they called her Dee Dee, was widowed at 22, pregnant with Lucy's younger brother.
I lived for the day when I could make life easy for them. No doubt about that.
Lucy's own childhood had been a series of tragedies. She was 3 when her father died, and 9 before she lived with her mother again, raised by a series of relatives. But adversity only seemed to give her strength. Lucy tells of going to New York City in her mid-teens, and even though she'd been a drama school washout, she writes, "For some incomprehensible reason, I knew I'd make it as an actress." In the meantime, she was modeling. She changed her name briefly to Diane Belmont and spiced up her resume.
For years, people thought my mother was born in Butte, Montana.
Which she encouraged.
And I went so far to write to the Chamber of Commerce of Butte and Anaconda and acquaint myself with every store, every corner. I could tell you more about Butte and Anaconda at that time than most people who lived there.
Butte, Montana. Sounds better. And then you can talk like this and be kind of a sassy girl. You know, kind of sassy. She liked to be sassy.
Kind of wet.
Yeah, rain usually is this time of year. Hattie'll be right up. Say, Butcher, why don't you meet Miss Farmer?
By the late 30s, she was known as the Queen of the Bees.
Dewberry was a lady.
It was then, at the age of 29, she met a younger man who knocked her off her feet. It apparently was mutual.
What'd your father say when he first laid eyes on her?
What a hunk of woman. What a hunk of woman. And she was.
When you hear yo te amo.
They met on a Hollywood backlot in 1940. He was pretty hot, too. The conga king of the nightclub circuit and a Broadway sensation.
She said she fell in love with him. Not love at first sight. She said it took 5 minutes. I mean, they were very hot and very heavy very quickly, apparently. It was great passion. Latin passion, Irish passion. Fights, you know, and immediate makeups and the kind of thing that movies are made of.
5 months after they met, against everyone's advice and her own better judgment, she writes, they eloped. It may have seemed a case of opposites attract, but they had a lot in common. Childhood adversity. Desi's family was Cuban aristocracy, wiped out during political upheaval. Like Lucy, he turned to showbiz to support his mother. And the eerie coincidence of their names, Desi, that's short for Desiderio, and Lucy's middle name was Desiree.
Desiree and Desiderio are the same word. They both mean desire.
Desire met desire.
Lucy sensed an inevitability to their relationship.
What did your mom figure the odds were that her marriage to Desi Arnaz would last?
She said she thought it would last 6 weeks. She did. She knew my father was a passionate sort of playboy person. She knew he was younger. She knew that he was living fast and hard, and she was an organized, responsible, take charge, pioneer stock person, quite different from the way he was raised. But they were passionately in love.
Lucy writes in loving detail about the early years with Desi Arnaz. At their home in Chatsworth, California, life was, well, a party.
We celebrated anything. Barbecues, dress-up birthday parties, old-fashioned swimming parties, Western parties, Halloween. I planned them for weeks ahead and invited the people. I've got the wonderful home movies of everybody all dressed up and having a ball.
That's Van Johnson's Swan Dive and Buster Keaton in The Straw Boater. It was Hollywood's heyday. They both wanted children. Lucy cut out pictures of babies from magazines and put them in her scrapbook. But it was hard to start a family being apart as much as a movie star and a band leader were.
It just occurred to them that if they worked together, if they could find a way to work together, that they could be together.
The solution? Television. The problem? Convincing the network.
I said, well, who in America is going to believe that this red-headed American, all-American woman is married to this Latin man from Cuba?
And I said, well, I am married to a Latin. It seems to me that there would be much more to work with if you're working with the truth.
Say, have you ever met a girl who's the toast of the town?
So in 1950, they hit the road.
We said, well, let's get an act together and go out and see what audiences think of us together. So we fashioned a Mr. and Mrs. Act.
They call me Sally Sweet.
As a vaudeville-style comedy team, they were heading for immortality.
Everything goes chick, chicky, boom, chick, chicky, boom.
Si, señorita, I know that you will like the cheeky boom chick.
Yeah, man.
He's very nice, so full of spice.
I Love Lucy blurred the line between TV life and real life. It was part of the show's appeal.
Oh, Ricky, please, just let me do the commercial.
Nothing doing.
Why not?
Look, honey, this is too big a chance for me. I need someone with a lot of experience.
Well, I've had experience.
America knew that he really was a band leader, that they were really married, and in 1952, that Lucy was really pregnant with her second child, Desi Jr.
The scene where Lucy can't get Ricky's attention to tell him that they're going to have a baby.
Well, that's a story that I never really knew until I read the book, oddly enough. She talks about how once they got into filming it, everybody knew how real it was, that they had waited this long to have these children.
When the bow breaks, the cradle will fall. Honey, no. Really?
Then everybody on the set was crying, and they thought they should do it again, but nobody would let them because it was so real.
The most significant tears were your father's.
Yeah.
We're having a baby, my baby, and me.
Ironically, though the idea of working together on I Love Lucy was to make it possible for Lucy and Desi to have a more stable family life, the marriage barely made it through the run of the TV show. Lucy writes, "I wanted to get as far away from Hollywood and Desi as humanly possible."
They really tried. They tried for 20 years to stay married and have the family and have the career. And I start getting into those chapters, and I remember. And it makes me sad because it comes back up, you know. I remember how dark those days were for everybody. You know, I can still remember the moment that it happened when my parents sat us down and said, we have to separate, we can't live together anymore. I can remember my brother turning to my mother and my father and saying, well, can't you fix it, Daddy? Can't you just take it all back? And him saying with tears in his eyes, no, partner, we can't.
On Dateline Tuesday, Lucy the Red, how Lucile Ball came to be called a communist and how Desi saved their empire from catastrophe.
From Studio 3B in New York, here again is Jane Pauley.
When I Love Lucy is no longer playing in syndication, it will be the end of TV as we know it, somebody once said, and they were probably right. Even if we were too young to see the show in its first run from 1951 to 1957, we've seen every episode a dozen times, and they only seem to get better with age. What was the magic? No doubt it was the partnership of two people who were perfect together on camera. But pictures don't tell the whole story. The rest of the story tonight, from Lucy herself.
That's very funny. Now come on out of there.
As our first offering this evening, we present...
Lucy, I said come on out of there.
After 45 years in nonstop syndication, Lucile Ball and Desi Arnaz long ago achieved broadcast immortality.
Lucy Ricardo! Are you crazy or something? What are you trying to do, barbecue me?
He died in 1986. She died in 1989, only weeks after she'd finally agreed to sit down and write her autobiography, perhaps forgetting she already had. Love Lucy is the name of her newly rediscovered memoir. Hardly anyone knew it existed. But 30 years ago, Lucy told her life story in hours of taped interviews, edited the manuscript by hand, and then with no explanation, changed her mind. Her children, Lucy and Desi Arnaz Jr., think they understand why.
She changed her mind. She didn't want to complete it. My father and she had just divorced, and I think she thought that she would hurt his feelings. It was so close then that she was afraid, I think.
She was at a crossroads when she wrote this book. It was important for her at that moment in her own life, whether she shared it with people or not.
I have never been unhappy since I had a modicum of success. I just thought it was great long before this.
Throughout her life, Lucile Ball carefully tended her General Foods image, as she called it.
I have never had a bad press or ugly fans. I've had love and admiration. Who can knock that?
Tell me something. Do you play that thing?
How's that?
I say, do you play that thing?
What then?
In 1951, she was shooting the pilot for what would become the most successful TV sitcom of all time. She was also, at the age of 40, about to have her first baby.
Never mind making fun of my English.
That's English.
In the book, at one point she talks when you were born about how difficult it was to leave you and knowing that when she went to the studio, it might be midnight before she came home.
Can you imagine if we had had to do that? I mean, the kind of never being around, mothering that you would have to accept. And she really literally had no choice at the time.
Working 6 days a week, sometimes 16 hours a day, Lucy saw her TV family much more than her real family.
She wasn't there. I had a nurse who took care of me from the moment that I was born, virtually. And then she would come home at midnight, like she said, and I was asleep, you know, and everything. Those were the toughest times for them with the show because it was a new show.
In 1951, television was in its infancy. When I Love Lucy went into production, there was no blueprint to follow. They were inventing a genre.
She was the star, but if history is accurately reported, he was the brains of the outfit?
When it got to I Love Lucy, yeah.
Right from the start, Lucy writes, Desi Arnaz turned out to be a huge star behind the camera.
It came about that he was a great director and a great producer. He can take a story apart, he can give you a synopsis of a story and pick out the highlights like that. Desi can really get down to the root of a story or a characterization. He became very, very good at this.
She got the laughs, but it was never at the expense of his dignity.
Never. And that was something that my father insisted upon. I mean, there's a whole series of rules that he laid out. I don't want Ricky to ever be the stupid husband who is the brunt of the jokes. If Lucy's going to pull over something over his eyes, the audience has to know he's in on it. The audience should never see her or him really flirting with anybody else. They should always know that this is first and foremost a romance.
The formula was an instant hit, but Lucy and Desi didn't know how famous they'd become till 1953, when they took a break from the Hollywood grind to see some shows in New York.
The first night there, we went to the theater. And as we're getting into our seat, applause broke out and a lot of hubbub, which went into a cheer. Well, at that time, Mrs. Roosevelt was in town, and we thought she was there. So we got up and we looked around and we applauded, and we're standing there going along with it, and we found it was for us.
Television had brought them success they could never have imagined. And then they almost lost it all.
Good evening, Mr. and Mr. North American. All the ships at sea. Let's go to press. Flash. New York.
Somebody tipped Walter Winchell to the fact that Lucile Ball had once been a communist.
It was on the front page of every paper. It was on the news. It was on television. It was on the radio. Lucile Ball is a card-carrying communist.
It was the height of the Red Scare. Countless careers in Hollywood had already been destroyed. It was Desi who made the decision to face the crisis head-on.
My father called up everybody he knew, from the heads of the networks to the sponsors, had bishops and priests and rabbis and all the people come to the show the night of the filming, made a big, huge speech in front of the audience, and basically told the truth.
Bottom line was, she had signed a membership card for the Communist Party. Lucile Ball?
Well, the bottom line was her grandfather, way back when it was okay to join a socialist party or be a communist, that was just like, you know, voting for Perot. It wasn't like a big deal. You could just choose, you know, it was no big deal.
After her own father died when she was just 3, Lucy called her grandfather Daddy. When she was 25, after he had suffered a stroke, Lucy, her mother, and brother all agreed to register with the Communist Party to humor him.
She never voted. My mother never voted. And she did it just to silence him and make him feel better.
Before the I Love Lucy show was filmed that night, Desi introduced Lucy to the studio audience, saying the only thing red about Lucy was her hair, and even that was fake. His PR gambit worked.
We'll build a bungalow big enough for 2.
Just 2 months later, they were performing in person for President Eisenhower.
In 24 hours, they could have lost everything. They were very lucky. They were very lucky.
Under the bamboo, underneath the bamboo tree.
The show went on for 4 more seasons, never out of the top 3. It remains a television phenomenon.
The plot lines survived. They're not dated. They were always about people. and needs and wants and love and jealousies and trying to make a buck and trying to make ends meet. And it's all the stuff that you can still relate to. You know, the hemlines change, that's all.
After I Love Lucy, her TV family featured her own real-life kids. But though she remarried, Lucy never had another TV husband.
Let me take this. With all these exploding cigars around, I never know when I'll need a spare.
This was the final episode of the Lucy Desi Comedy Hour, guest starring Ernie Kovacs. It was the last time the Ricardos appeared together. Lucy filed for divorce that same day.
When the show ended, you realize that it's the end of an era. It was the end of that magic.
It's taken her years, but Lucy Arnaz has finally organized all of her parents' showbiz memorabilia and the home movies and the photographs literally by the thousands on a CD-ROM. We'll be telling you about it later this fall on Dateline.